everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is HarrisX founder and CEO, Dritan Nesho. Dritan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me again.
There is a new Harvard Caps Harris poll, and it covers a lot about the sentiment around domestic and foreign events, the economy, the midterms. But as usual, I want to start right at home, starting at the top at the White House with President Trump's approval rating, and then we can go on from there. So as we sit here right now, we're at the start of primary season. President Trump is a little over a week out of giving his State of the Union address. What does his approval rating look like?
Well, the president seems to be trending back up in terms of his job approval. He's at 46%, which is up just a point when it comes to last month. But really, his approval rating has been quite rocky over the span of the last 3 to 4 months, and took a bit of a dip from December to January, given all the immigration actions in Minnesota and Minneapolis, which voters did not react as favorably to as they have to some of his other policies. So it seems like coming out of the State of the Union address, and this poll was conducted right after the State of the Union address in the 48 hours following the State of the Union address, he seems to be picking back up share of approval. And importantly, he's at 57%, he's at 50% approval amongst likely voters, compared to 47% disapproval. That's very important because these are the voters that are intending to show up during the midterms and will determine the fate of whichever way the midterms go, Republican or Democrat. And that's a very, very positive sign for the administration and for President Trump.
This is definitely welcome news for him, right? Especially when you see the dip in your approval rating. Now it's going back up. So the question has to be why? What are some of those policies of his that are getting the highest marks amongst voters?
Well, what was interesting in the State of the Union address is that all of the new policies that the president recommended in the State of the Union address, and we can talk about that, scored very, very highly. And in fact, we asked the question after the fact along the lines of, if the president and the Republicans are able to push these policies through, would it make you more or less likely to vote for them in the midterms? And actually, the Republicans would gain 4 points, which is fairly substantial if they're able to push those policies. So specifically, the specific ideas in the State of the Union were very well received. In general, too, most of the policies, the specific issue positions that the administration has taken have been at above 50% support. Frankly, since the beginning, there's very few exceptions to that rule. And so also heading into the State of the Union, in general, a small majority of voters believe that President Trump has been very consistent with his campaign promises. That's about 53%. They believe that he's delivering and working that against those promises. That's at 54%. And again, the specific issue positions are quite positive, even though voters have qualms with how the administration executes on some of those policies, right? And you see that very clearly reflected in what voters think on immigration and how they rate the administration's actual performance on the issue. But by and large, Trump has picked up on the economy. His approval on the economy was 43% last month. This month, or February, was at 45%. He's picked up on his handling on the immigration with the pivot that he did after Minneapolis and the incidents there. So he was at 46, now he's at 48. He's picked up points on foreign affairs, and I would have to note that this was before the Iran intervention. President was at 42%. Now he's at 45%. And then he scores very well or higher in terms of fighting crime. He's at 51%. In January, he was at 47%. And then also returning America to its values. He was at 45%. Now he's at 48%. And this is really a lot of voters and a lot of the atmospherics in the polling. There's this sentiment of America is back, right? For good or for bad, with all the commotion, there is a measure of confidence in the country that is growing, and that really starts with the economy. And that's where we actually see some interesting movement that matters for the midterms in terms of voter perceptions around the economy.
It always comes back to the economy. And typically, when a president has been in office for a year or more, their approval rating trends with the economy, or at least the way people perceive the economy. But I want to talk about some numbers in particular and how you exactly square these, because 51% of voters from this poll say the U.S. economy is strong today, but only 36% of voters say their personal financial situation is improving. So how do you square that? More people are saying, hey, the economy's strong, but only 36% of people say, I really like where I'm at financially.
Yeah, I think what matters is looking at the trends over the span of the last 5 or 6 months, right? That measure on how strong the economy is was at 43% 5 months ago in the fall. In part, the president created a lot of the frustration on the economy himself with Liberation Day and the tariffs. You saw that after Trump's election, perceptions on the economy started to trend up and trend up very strongly. Then they took a dive between April and really the fall, the end of the year, with all of the tariff activity. And now, with the renewed focus that the administration has taken on messaging around the economy and trying to close the perception gap on the fact that the country's economy is actually growing, not shrinking. A majority think that it's actually shrinking. So that's obviously a gap that can be closed by repeating the facts and making sure that voters are properly aware of where economic growth stands. And in a similar fashion, inflation has been sub 3%, even though the perceptions on inflation and affordability tend to still be fairly dour and fairly negative, right? And so the administration has taken a renewed focus, and it seems to be working. It's starting to shift some of the perceptions on the economy. So, as I said, the strength of the economy measure has grown from 43% to 51% in the last 6 months. Economy on the right track is trending. 3, 4 months ago, it was at about 33, 34%. Today, it's at 38%, still underwater, but the trend matters. And then on the very important question of, would you say your personal financial situation is improving or getting worse? You actually see a fairly consistent upwards trend on that. And again, in the last 6 months, it's gone from about 32% to 36%. So these are small wins for the administration, and it can always snap back the perceptions on a negative footing, but they're important wins because, as you said, the key issue for voters remains affordability, remains inflation, and really that's what they care about above everything else that the administration is doing. So, as the administration starts to tackle this, if these perceptions hold, if this positive trend hold, then that is a very positive augur for them as they head into the midterms.
Last week, President Trump made history. In his first State of the Union in his second term, he officially delivered the longest one in America's history, clocked in at an hour and 48 minutes about. And you said earlier in this conversation that a lot of the policies he was talking about in that hour and 48 minutes, they were well received. So what are they?
Perfect. Well, I think it's important to note that, close to half of all voters watched the State of the Union, and those who watched it gave President Trump a fairly positive rating. 60% said that they were favorable to the address, despite the address being so long. And as we talked about at the outset, the specific proposals that he pushed through were very, very well received by voters. And I'm going to read this because it's a fairly extensive list. But the proposed ban on stock trading from members of Congress while they're in office, 72% support, consistent and strong support across Republicans, obviously at 83%, independents at 68%, Democrats 63%. And again, likely midterm voters, 75%. So this is a clear policy that you can expect the administration to be pushing through because it picks up voters, including swing voters. Giving working Americans without employer retirement plans access to federal style accounts with up to $1,000 in government matching, 70% support. You know, it's often said that the American economy is, 40% are within the markets and benefiting from the markets and benefiting from the growth, and 60% are outside of that. It's clear from several of these proposals, especially this one, but also the Trump accounts for children, that President Trump is trying to bring that other 60% into the markets and giving upside to every American child, and in this case, retirees, and potentially to all Americans. This is actually a very smart strategy from the administration, and again, it's very, very positively received. Another policy that ranked very highly was instituting a permanent ban on large Wall Street firms and institutional investors purchasing single family homes, 69% approval, asking Congress to make the Trump administration's most favored nation drug pricing deals permanent, 68% approval, launching the ratepayer protection pledge and forcing the technology companies to commit to that so that energy prices are not affected by the proliferation of AI data centers. 67% support, again, consistent support across all of the different voter groups, including 55% of Democrats supporting it. Introducing the great healthcare plan to stop, as the president said, billions in federal payments to insurers and redirect that money directly to individuals for lower cost coverage issues, and also creating full price transparency, 67%, and so on, right? Like the lowest rated of all of the policy proposals was using tariffs from foreign countries to gradually replace much of the income tax system, which voters again have mixed feelings on tariffs, don't quite know what to do with it, but even that rated at 54% support. So you could say that the president scored points with the State of the Union address, and I think that this has been fairly consistent with the polling and contributes actually to perhaps the turn in sentiment around the economy and the turn in sentiment around the fact that people believe the government is, starting to do things, right? Sometimes not in the right way, but they agree with the large or the loose goals that the government has and the administration has in terms of those policies.
And then before we get to Democrats, what are some of those weak spots right now for the administration? Where is President Trump and Republicans in general, where are they scoring the lowest?
Well, immigration was intended to be, um, or the action on immigration that the administration undertook in January in Minneapolis and Minnesota was intended to elevate immigration as an issue before the midterms. And let's just say that, they screwed the pooch on it. Um, it was highly problematic, and voters actually reacted negatively, even though they agree with the administration around, getting legal immigrants, and especially criminal illegal immigrants out of the country, right, and making sure that that enforcement continues. So I think that immigration remains a low point or a dangerous place for the administration, but the steps that they are taking have been well received. The pivot undertaken by the border czar Tom Homan in Minneapolis, where they're going after specific enforcement, targeted enforcement rather than blanket enforcement, has been positively received. So I think it's something to keep an eye out on. And again, the president was elected on economics and immigration. So obviously, this is one of the core issues and one of the core drivers of support for him. And it's not something that the administration is likely to leave behind. So, as often, strengths are weaknesses and weaknesses are strengths. And I think that that's clearly reflected on the immigration issue.
And before we button up the State of the Union conversation, I do want to talk about Democrats because they handled the State of the Union a few different ways, right? Some Democrats, over 24 Democrats, went to a counter rally in protest of the State of the Union. They didn't attend. Some attended. They sat stoically. They weren't really reacting to what President Trump was saying. And then some other Democrats, they were yelling back at Trump. Some Democrats marched out of the State of the Union mid-speech. How did voters perceive that? And then let's talk about the Democratic response, because that seems like, in politics, one of the most thankless jobs of all times, right? Best case scenario for you, if you're giving that speech, you don't end up on SNL that weekend. That wasn't the case here with Virginia's new governor, Abby Spanberger. What did that all look like? How did voters perceive all of that?
So we'll start there. I mean, those who watched the Democratic response actually had positive reactions to it. 60% reacted positively to it, but it was a small group of voters or a smaller group of voters, about a quarter, that actually watched the Democratic response and tuned in to it. And in general, in terms of the theatrics within the State of the Union, we asked, was it appropriate or inappropriate for some Democrats to boycott President Trump's speech? Voters were largely split on that question. 52% appropriate, 48% inappropriate. They had a more negative view of the disruptions and the jeering by several Democrats during the speech. 57% found that to be inappropriate. But really, where the rubber meets the road is in the midterm horse race question, right? And last time around, the Democrats had a 4-point advantage on the midterm horse race question, 54, actually 8-point advantage, 54 to 46%. And this time it's dead even. It's 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans. And so it seems like voters are rewarding the administration and the Republicans with the actions that they've undertaken, especially in terms of turning around their immigration policy and everything that was proposed during the State of the Union address. And really, that's the metric that shows which party is doing better than the other, right? And which party has more traction with voters than the other.
Let's talk about the midterms then and dive right in, because primary elections officially are underway starting this week. And we're seeing some messaging take place and take shape from Republicans and Democrats. What's working for both of them?
Well, it was interesting. We tested a series of messages from both the Democrats and the Republicans. And actually, I'll focus less on what the messages are, because the messages will evolve, and people can look at them within our poll and our link at harvardharrispoll.com. But it's the effect that matters, right? And what we notice is that the Republican messaging is much more effective than the Democratic messaging. It moves the dial and it shifts the horse race from 50-50, a dead even, before being exposed to messages, to 51-49. So the GOP picks up 2 points relative to the Democrats after exposure to both the Democratic messaging and the Republican messaging in a randomized fashion. So net, Republican messaging is stronger than Democratic messaging at this stage heading into the midterms. Can it change? Absolutely. But as I mentioned, also the policy proposals that the administration brought to the table during the State of the Union give the Republicans even more traction over the span of the next 6, 7 months. And again, they have momentum, I would say, at this stage. The Republicans have momentum. Will it last? We don't know, but that's where the state of play is right now.
From the few elections we saw in November 2025, we saw two different types of Democratic messaging emerge. One was more focused on affordability, the other was more centered on countering President Trump. When you tested these amongst voters now, what's the more effective message?
Well, I would say that the United States still remains a centrist or perhaps on the aggregate center right country, right? And so Americans are overwhelmingly for free enterprise over socialist policies. And we tested that in our polling. And again, you have 76% support for free enterprise, and many of the policy proposals that, let's say, were anchor proposals in Zoran Mandami's campaign for New York City mayor, including, government-owned housing or government-run grocery stores. Those are not ideas that have a lot of traction with voters, including with significant chunks of the Democratic Party. So really, the U.S. still tends to prefer moderate politicians with moderate policy proposals. I think that's what's quite interesting for President Trump is that um, President Trump's issues and policy proposals are largely viewed to be at the center and viewed to be common sense. His rhetoric is viewed to be more center right and sometimes even farther still on the far right. And again, it's that rhetoric that gets in the way of those great proposals and potentially the administration having even better approval ratings with voters and better traction politically. And I think that that's a key takeaway from this poll, right? Focusing on why the administration wants to do what it wants to do, not just what they want to do, and explaining that further and making sure that the policies speak for themselves and are not sidetracked by the rhetoric that's oftentimes attached to how they're brought to market or how they're brought to the voters.
I do now want to pivot to some of the news that has been broken in the past month since you and I talked, because at the end of February, the Supreme Court made a big decision, 6-3 decision, that struck a major blow to President Trump's trade agenda. The Supreme Court struck down a large swath of his tariffs, ruling that the president did not have the authority to invoke them. How do voters feel about this decision?
Well, voters don't believe that the president should have the authority to invoke tariffs during non-emergency situations. Now, what's interesting in our polling is that the justification for the tariffs that the Trump administration proposed, right? The drug epidemic, fentanyl epidemic in the United States, and also the large US trade deficits, they're actually seen by voters as being real issues and being real emergencies by 62%. So again, it gets to the point of the rhetoric, the messaging. The administration didn't do a good enough job to explain to voters why they were doing what they were doing and why these constituted national emergencies. They also could have brought in Congress to the task, right, and try to build a broader coalition. So for all of those reasons, voters are siding with the Supreme Court and believing that these did not constitute emergency situations. And 6 in 10 voters view the Supreme Court decision as having been appropriate in terms of limiting non-emergency powers that the president has.
I do now want to pivot to the Save America Act, passed in the House. It's facing an uphill battle in the Senate right now, and the legislation would require proof of U.S. citizenship to register to vote, and it would make voters show a form of identification in order to vote. It would also mandate that states share voter information with the Department of Homeland Security. How do voters feel about this?
Very strong support for voter ID requirements for voting and also proof of citizenship, and by extension, support for passing the act as well. So this is actually an issue where the administration has as close to a slam dunk position as can be expected. Overall, 60% of voters do believe that voting is secure in the country, but 40% do not, and that's a very large amount of voters. And 54%, say that it's difficult for illegal immigrants to vote, but 46% actually think that it's actually quite easy, right? And so it's you have enough of a group of voters to support this, both on practical reasons and on principle, that it actually has given a fairly strong base of support for requiring voter ID and proof of citizenship.
You and I spoke about Venezuela last month, but I am curious on how voters feel about it 2 months out. And to refresh viewers' memories, at the beginning of the year, U.S. forces launched an attack on the capital of Venezuela. It resulted in the capture of Nicolas Maduro, the country's sitting leader. Currently, Maduro's in a U.S. jail. He faces drug, narco-terrorism, and weapons charges. And directly after the operation, President Trump said that the United States would be running Venezuela until we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. He also said that we would be heavily involved in the country's oil industry. I'm curious how voters feel about this now, 2 months out.
Well, it seems like voters are coming behind the Venezuela action more and more. So now close to 6 in 10 of voters believe that it was the right action to have been taken, and uh, in the national security interest of the United States. And in general, when we tested several different concepts, and we will have fresh polling on Iran that we'll share with Forbes in the next 24 hours. But in general, there was support for America taking a strong stance against narco trafficking, especially in its own backyard in Latin America. The United States pressuring Mexico to do more to fight the cartels, which obviously it did recently. With the United States prohibiting Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon, which had 7 in 10 supporting it. And in a similar fashion, the United States undertaking action in Venezuela. So the administration's foreign policy is seeing strong support or majority support, with one exception, acquiring Greenland and its push on Greenland, where only about 4 in 10 voters support that policy, and 6 in 10 voters or 7 in 10 voters, depending on which questions you ask, basically believe that there's inherently more value in a strong NATO alliance and strong relationships with our European partners than there is in going after Greenland. And so, except for Greenland, most of the initiatives that the administration has score majority support. And again, restraining the global influence of China and Russia, and obviously stopping Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, which is one of the key rationales for the action in Iran, have support among 7 in 10 of voters, and sometimes even more.
And just to wrap up this poll, when you're looking at the major takeaways, because it is so wide ranging, if you could just picture in your head who is emerging as some winners here and who are emerging as the losers, what would you think?
Well, I think that the dust has yet to settle, and US voters tend to be very results driven and very pragmatic. Because of that, they see that the Trump administration is engaging in a lot of actions, and they're rewarding the administration because of that, even when they have question marks or qualms about how the action is undertaken. But really, it's victory that begets victory and performance, and we will see, hopefully by our next poll, whether or not the momentum that the GOP and the Trump administration has been able to secure over the span of the last 30 days is momentum that they can sustain heading into the election, or not.
Well, certainly a lot to look out for. And Dritan, per usual, I always appreciate our conversations. Thank you so much for the poll and providing all of your insight here. Until next time.
See you soon. Thank you for the opportunity.